Public procurement is, transparency in public procurement is crucial because we're talking about so much public money that is spent, so there are very high corruption risks. So having transparency and open data, especially on public procurement, is really important. And we have some EU minimum standards through the procurement directive, but in some EU member states we have excellent practices that could and should be scaled and really can be considered best practices. So for example, in Slovenia, we have a very strong Freedom of Information Act that allows the public to request information about public contracts. In Slovakia, we actually have the mandatory requirement for all public sector contracts to be published if they're above 1,000 euros. So we're not only talking about public procurement, we're talking about privatizations, licenses, rent agreements. So these contracts have to be published online. If they're not publicly accessible, then they're not valid. So this is an excellent enforcement mechanism, and it really ensures that there is a strong level of transparency. And since Slovakia has introduced this mechanism, we've also seen that that the number of average bidders has increased substantially. So we see that transparency not only deters corruption risks, but it also encourages competition. And of course, public monitoring and public accountability. So transparency in public procurement is crucial, and there are best practice models out there that can be scaled and adopted by other countries. When we talk about open data and procurement, one important other issue is beneficial ownership transparency, meaning that we have publicly accessible databases that list the ultimate owners of the companies that win government contracts. And here also the EU has introduced minimum standards with the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. That's again a practice that I think can be the basis for other countries to adopt somewhat similar mechanisms. And when we look at whistleblowing, that is a big issue in many parts of the world. How can we protect and encourage whistleblowers to come forward, to report on corruption, to report on wrongdoing, to report on issues that might pose a public danger or are in the public interest? We see great interest in Latin America, for example, where we have a lot of corruption cases coming up, but the challenge is how can we protect those that unveil the corruption, that report. And here we have, with the European Whistleblower Directive, we have, I think, a base standard that we can build upon. There are, of course, areas to improve it. And here it's really important that academia, civil society now look at the procurement directive as it is now step-by-step implemented by member states, so that we can figure out how can we build on the minimum standard across Europe, make it better, and make sure that the new standards, new laws that are adopted across Europe are really up to international best practice in law and in implementation.
Yes, in practical view, whistleblowing has particular importance for the prosecution of tax criminal offenses. But we have indeed a plethora of other means to collect and get information and evidence on these cases. But in fact, the first information often comes from insiders. So we can go further on with our prosecution methods after getting a first hint in what way we should lead our prosecution paths. So I think whistleblowing has a certain role indeed in the practical view of prosecuting tax crimes. What's the protection of whistleblowers within the labor law? So I think this could be improved within the Austrian legislation, and I think we are on we're on the starting point to deal with this problem within our legislation. That's not only the labor law that is concerned, but also, for instance, civil tort law, if there are some problems with losing of economical power of the targeted corporation, for instance, and so on. And also on the criminal side, the improvement of the criminal protection of the whistleblower is, I think, necessary. But you have also to challenge and to take into consideration what are the limits of whistleblowing. What's the limit for legitimate whistleblowing? So the public interest is a cornerstone, and it must not threaten the society in its cornerstone, like trust in the interaction with other people. So that's the other side of the problematic side of whistleblowing, in my view.
Legislation is not enough, and for an effective and I would say successful implementation, we can't rely only on legislation. And a crucial factor, in my opinion, in order to enhance the effectiveness of implementation is the cultural dimension. Usually, cultural dimension, cultural factors are considered as secondary, not so important, and they are taken aside by governments. In my opinion, much effort should be made on cultural dimension if we want to implement whistleblowing protection, especially two aspects. The first one is that in some countries, the term whistleblower has a negative meaning. In some countries, whistleblowers are considered traitors, informants, or even worse, snitches. And how can a legislation can be implemented in an effective way if we think that a whistleblower is a traitor? It's impossible. The second aspect is that whistleblower should believe that his reporting would be in some sort way, in a way taken on board by somebody. And if he believes that reporting is futile and nobody will take it seriously, I mean, there will be any incentives for making any reports.
Okay, I think the EU directive on whistleblower protection is a very welcome addition to the legal framework in the EU. It adds very important provisions for the protection of whistleblowers. We must also bear in mind that we've had the Court of Justice of the Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, decisions on whistleblowers in the context of Article 10, freedom of expression. And what will be interesting to see in the future is whether the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights make consistent decisions protecting the interests of the whistleblowers. And also it will be interesting to monitor if and to what extent the directive will create the enabling environment where whistleblowers feel empowered to come forward and share information in the public interest. The other important aspect of the directive is the financial support that is envisaged to be provided to the whistleblowers. I think this is an essential element because most whistleblowers, according to empirical studies, show that they face some form of reprisal or retaliation, and in order to challenge that in the courts, they need legal aid. And I think this is absolutely fundamental if you want to really achieve meaningful results in protecting whistleblowers. Every country should put some resources in place to enable whistleblowers to invoke their rights in judicial proceedings. And that can only be achieved by legal aid.
Yes, after the recent approval of the EU directive on whistleblowing protection, it's becoming even more important to highlight the current implementation of these protection measures in each member state, as well as to highlight the efforts that many countries have still to make. Indeed, nowadays only few countries in the EU have a national law entirely dedicated to whistleblowing protection, while most of them provide a protection of whistleblower through more comprehensive law or provision in sector-based laws. So one of the issues that we can identify is, first of all, the definition of whistleblowing. Only in some European countries, a whistleblower is expressly defined by law, and more often we can find only implicit definitions within the law, and sometimes we cannot even find a specific legal definition of what a whistleblower is. So this situation could be create specific issues. The directive does not expressly require the whistleblower to act in good faith, but to act in the justified belief that the information reported is true and falls within the scope of the directive. But in the member states, this requirement of good faith differs greatly from one country to another. Well, then another issue is related to the catalogue of breaches that may be reported, which is wide and varied in each member state. The directive adopted a broad notion of breaching, failing within its scope, but nonetheless some countries adopt a notion even wider, for instance, including violations of just professional ethics or of the principles of proper administration. And some countries, on the contrary, limit the subject only to the reports related to corruption cases. And I could also mention the problem of the extent of the whistleblowing protection. State administration, public companies, but we should also implement the national legislation in order to cover the larger sector of private companies. I could mention also the need of developing the specific reporting channels within the organizations, because in many countries, at least since now, they are missing, or when established, they are not sufficiently developed. This is just a very short overview, but I think it can be useful to give you the idea that EU member states have to work a lot on the next years if we want that this measure really become a fundamental tool in order to deter and detect corruption in our countries.
Whistleblowers, I think, are very colorful figures in modern society. They have an important role, and it's difficult to capture or to design a legal framework that really makes their activities useful and productive for combating all kinds of, cases of corruption or malfeasant behavior of organizations. Both of the projects that we're involved in, which is the PROTAX project and the WOODIe project, try to address this problem from different angles. The one is more on the tax crime side, the other is more on the side of whistleblower legislation in general, and also open data, government data. I think the important point is that to really fill the gap between the formal black letter law, so the legal regulations, as you can find them in the European directives on the one hand, and the practical implementation and the cultural resonance towards actors like individuals like whistleblowers. And we're trying to fill this gap and raise the awareness also among lawmakers and policy actors to better find a better grounding, a better implementation, a better routing for whistleblowing as a necessary societal practice.